Thank you. I'm sorry, but I couldn't hear a lot of the comments, because I guess being behind that pillar or whatever, but I'm getting old and getting deaf too, Somebody said it was related to the immigrant experience. Well, it's not like coming from Iran to Canada. It's much more like coming from a backwards village in Iran to Tehran, or coming from Sicily to Rome, or in this case, the maritime provinces to Toronto. It's basically country mouse, city mouse. It's the country boy goes to the city. And that's universal in every society you can think of. And what got me thinking about it was that my surname Shebib is Arabic word for, I think means youthful. My grandparents came here from Lebanon in the 1890s on my father's side, and my mother's side is Irish, and they came in the 1790s. And I was very aware of the immigration of the Newfies, because my mother was Irish Newfoundlander, and my dad was born in Cape Breton. And Cape Breton is much closer to being a Newfoundlander than it is to being a Nova Scotian. Once you cross that Strait of Cancel, I guess, whatever it is, I've forgotten, into the island of Cape Breton, it's a whole different world than, Halifax is like Toronto in comparison. And so I knew all about Cape Bretoners and Newfoundlanders coming to Toronto. In fact, most Cape Bretoners didn't come to Toronto up until after World War II. They went down to Boston, which has the largest percentage of Canadians of any city in America. So, and it was called the Boston States. That's how they referred to the city of Boston. So the Maritimers were never Toronto Maple Leaf fans. They're always Boston Bruin fans. And they naturally migrated there. It was after the World War II that they started coming to Toronto. So I was aware of that, and I was also influenced by John Steinbeck's book, or more accurately, John Ford's film, The Grapes of Wrath, about the Okies going to California. And while I was in California for 5 years studying, I was aware of the Okies and how they went there. So that was all part of a similar migration pattern within the bounds of a certain country. And so that's what got me to make it. And a couple of years ago, I did a sequel to the film, which probably most of you haven't seen. It's actually a much better film. And it surprised me when I started. For years, people were saying to me they wanted me to make a sequel, which I didn't want to do. What am I, Going Down the Road 2, or Son of Going Down the Road, or something? So I finally sat down and said, well, I think I can get Telefilm to back this film if I sit down and try and make it. So I started writing the script, and everything just fell into place. And what's surprising about the two films together is that you would think that they were both written at the same time, because the other one fits into this one like that. It makes the first film a better film, because there's lots of flaws in this film. It's basically, to me, a student film made by a talented young filmmaker. But it has a lot of flaws in it, and it got far much more praise than I thought it ever deserved. But I've been making films, and also most of my documentaries have been about people on the fringes of society. My first documentary was made about surfers, because I was one. And when I came back to Canada, I made a film called Satan's Choice, which is about bikers who they're now Hells Angels, but in those days it was sort of sex and drugs and rock and roll and beer and having a good time. It wasn't organized crime like it is now. And then I did a film about a high school basketball team. I did a film about the hippies in California in 1967. I did a film, my best film was the film I did about old war veterans. So all those people were people on the fringes of society, on the outskirts. And these people were on the outskirts. So I just gravitated towards those people in that kind of position. I got a lot of flack about the film from some critics because it was very male-directed in terms of these guys, these couple of yahoos, But then 10 years later, not by any plan, but I did a film called Heartache, which I think is my Best Feature Film, which is about two wacky broads who work in an Italian mattress factory. And it's the kind of female counterpart to that film, even though it's nothing to do with that story at all. It's a totally different story. But I didn't want this film to represent my complete, total view of womanhood. It was just about these guys, and these girls. And these are basically uneducated, working class people who are in many ways the salt of the earth of this country. And I didn't think they ever got their due respect. And so I wanted to make a film about the kind of people, and I guess in some ways it was influenced by the English, what they call kitchen sink films of the 50s. That Richard Burton was in, and a whole bunch of people. I don't know if you're familiar with those films or not, but this was that kind of somewhat similar to that. And one of the things that bothered me about the film was, which I addressed in the sequel, was about sort of callous way that that Joey left Betty and the child behind. And what happens in the sequel is you get a lot of the backstory about why Pete left Nova Scotia to begin with. He left because he fell in love with this girl who was from a wealthy family, and he got her pregnant and he wanted to marry her, but they wouldn't allow it because he was the son of a poor miner. So he and Joey left. And then during the course of their stay in Toronto, which wasn't in the film at this film because I didn't think of it then, but what happens was when you see the second part of it was a letter comes to Pete from this girl, a special delivery letter. And Pete's not home, and Joey gets the letter, and he realizes it's from this girl, Annie, and he knows whatever's in that letter is going to get Pete to go back to Nova Scotia, leaving him alone in Toronto. So he sent the letter back, address unknown. So he's saddled with that guilt through the film, and that's why he does what Pete wants to do. And part of the film is when the sequel starts with Joey's death, because for one thing, I wanted all the people who played original parts, and the guy who played Joey, Paul Bradley, had passed away. So he goes back as a bequest from Joey. He finds the old car, which has been stuck in a garage in some farm, and he's got some money to fix it up, and he wants Pete to drive his ashes back to Toronto. In the meantime, to stop in Toronto and say hello to Betty, which he does, and she doesn't even want anything to do with him, and slams the door in his face. But then when his child, his daughter, who's now 35, realizes Pete is taking her father's ashes back to Nova Scotia, cons her way into going back with him. So it's about their relationship. It's not a romantic relationship. And so they go on this journey back to Nova Scotia, where a whole bunch of other things are all revealed. And in a way, it was Joey's way of making up for that crime he'd committed by denying Pete the chance to go back and meet his girl. And so it's all pays off that way, and it works very well. But I think seeing the two films together, the second film makes the first film a better film, because it addresses a lot of the flaws I think are in the film. And the film is, I was always really good with music in film, and a lot of this film was saved by some, really terrific editing on my part. But it's like, in some ways, it's like a cheap cherry pie with not many cherries in it. It's a lot of filling, And I always get a little nervous when I see lots of montages and things like that. Now they're pretty clever in this film. They work to a certain degree, but I think that's a weakness of the film. Because don't forget, there were no Canadian films around. This was the first fucking one in English Canada, So I was, why and how I ever actually got the balls to do it and to actually go out there and make it, I don't know what possessed me to do it. Everyone thought I was nuts. And I made it. It was actually made for $27,000. And and it was done in reversal film, which is why it's so grainy, because they hadn't even invented 16 millimeter negative at that point for Kodak. That didn't come until about 5 or 6 years later. So the blow-up was expensive. The blow-up was $50,000. Now blow-up is, they don't even do them anymore, just press a button. But so it's much easier to make a cheap film today than it was then. And $27,000 was about as cheap as you could possibly ever make any movie for. And I paid everybody, too. I mean, nobody was working for nothing. Didn't pay them a lot, but I paid them all. I don't know what else I can say, but I mean, I've seen it a lot. You know, it's never moved me as much as the second film has. The second film is much more emotional, and I'm moved by it. I've never been quite that moved by this film, because I was, you know, and without the two actors in the lead, the film could have been a complete turkey, you know, as particularly Paul Bradley, who was really brilliant in it. And a lot of times he was drunk, you know, and that's who he was. And I had a lot of soul searching over casting him, because he'd never acted anything before except a bit of comedy skits. And I didn't know whether I should take a chance on him or not. But in the end, I said, you know, with that face, you can't lose, you know. So I went with him, and he carried the film on his back. So did Doug McGrath, as he does in the sequel. But it was really Joey's magic that I think made the film really work more than anybody's, even though everybody in it was good. And a lot of the other guys who were in the plant, they were just guys. They weren't actors at all, you know. Somebody was saying about, you know, you can do a film cheaply. Well, the most important thing in making a film is time. And time, of course, when you're making a film where everybody's getting paid, is money. So suddenly a film that's $50,000, if you pay them on a professional basis, suddenly becomes $3 million. So time is always far more important than money. And in this film, I had lots of time. And that was the important thing.
All right.
And a lot of this film, reason that the film works is because of the script from this guy, Bill Pruitt, who I think wrote a terrific script, even though it has lots of flaws in it, and a lot of those flaws are my fault as well. I mean, this was my first attempt to make a dramatic film. But it wasn't, I mean, the kind of documentary films I made then, and I still make, are not the kind of documentary films that most people associate with the word documentary today. I mean, most of them are look like they're something on Eyewitness News, or an item on The National, or 60 Minutes. It's what the CBC used to call, in the old days, public affairs. They're usually about issues, or they're, you know, they'll find some guy who's, you know, my mother was in Auschwitz, and so she's going back to visit, so they follow her, or some guy is doing this, and they try and find people who have a story within them. I made films about where there were no stories, and I took undramatic material and forced it into a dramatic form, which is really the essence of what good filmmaking is. You know, I mean, I can make a film with a fucking coffee cup, and I'm not kidding. It won't be a very long film, but I can make a film out of a coffee cup. And I don't care much for documentaries of that kind of ilk. You know, I'd far rather see an interesting film on an uninteresting subject than an uninteresting film but an interesting subject. And I'm more interested in the way, the style of the film makes. A very close friend of mine, Carol Ballard, was a fellow named Carol Ballard, who was a brilliant filmmaker at UCLA. And Carol directed one of the great American films ever made, called The Black Stallion, about the boy and the horse, which he was produced by Francis Coppola. And Carol and Francis and I were all classmates at UCLA. And as a matter of fact, Dementia 13, which was Francis's first feature film, was run last night on TCM because it was a horror film. And I was the assistant editor on that film. But Carol was a brilliant genius who which again, make a film out of a coffee cup or a pencil. He was just a brilliant filmmaker. And so for both Carol and I, when we made our first step into dramatic films, it wasn't a big step, because we've been playing that, taking undramatic material and forcing it into a dramatic form in all of our films, in our use of music, etc., etc. And Francis to a similar extent. So it wasn't like I was some guy who made some film about, I don't know, some labor dispute, and following that with a, his handheld camera and the usual sort of documentary style. That's not dramatic filmmaking. We were already dramatic filmmakers making films with undramatic material. So it was an easy step for me to get into features, as opposed to a lot of people who make documentary films and they try and make a film about, they don't know how to do it. It's a different ballgame. But for us, for the kind of films we made, it was an easy step. I wish I could have heard more of the comments. I'm sorry, just that the room is not the best over here.
All right, thank you very much. Yep, thank you. So what we usually do is we go to the question and answer, and I don't know, given the number of people that we have here, I'll just, I earmarked about 30 minutes of that. So between 25 30 minutes of question and answers. And then later on we'll go to discussions, and then the floor is open to everyone, and so everyone can talk to each other. So given that the ice was broken by Don, I want you to all ask whatever you want to ask, even if it means you want to use obscenities or whatever you want. So I'll go with Mojtaba first. Yeah.
What do you think about the movie? I think, what do you think about the task of movie? The task of movie is to reflect reality or to bring new images, or you think there are...
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite get that.
The task of movie, what is the task of movie? What do you think about the task of movie? What is the job of movie? To reflect new reality or bringing new image to audience? Because I think you are trying to expose the reality, not bringing a new image. And I just want to know what's your point. What do you think about movie? What is the job of movie?
I think what the question is, what's your objectives? What do you want to basically portray in the movie? Did you have any vocations maybe to make the film, or?
I mean, in making movies generally?
No. In this particular movie, I believe, like the whole message of the movie, I believe.
Well, there's an old saying: if you want to send a message in a film, call Western Union, which is that's an old Hollywood saying, but it's not that I was not making any political point. The film got a lot of great praise by sort of leftist papers in Canada and the United States, and I never meant it to be in that way one way or the other. I meant it to be just about two human beings. And I was interested in a way of reaching a general audience with two kinds of guys that most people wouldn't want to spend the time of day with. These are a couple of, uneducated, sweet, hardworking local yokels. And I want to say, hey, I'm going to make you, Mr. and Mrs. Sophisticate, like these people, in spite of what you may think about them on the surface. And I want their humanity to come through and touch you, no matter what your background is. And that's one thing that drove me in making the film, as it does in many of my documentaries. I had to work very hard to get the trust of the people. Probably no one harder than the hippies in California, who didn't trust anybody in the media. And I made this film in 1967. But even the old war soldiers, because I made that in 1968, just before I made this film, and in which at a time during the Vietnam War when soldiers were looked down upon as being practically Nazis, and they didn't trust anybody coming from the CBC or anywhere else to make a film about them. But I made a film about them that is all about love and war, and about the love of soldiers have for each other, no matter what side they're on. And so, I mean, and that's a film that basically really nails it to the audience. And that's a film that I really had a knife out for the audience. I stuck it right in their hearts. And because the way they treated the veterans of Vietnam, the way they've always treated soldiers when they come back after the war is over, which nobody remembers what the war was ever about. But the soldiers are always treated badly. And this was about that. So sometimes there's a very strong message in the film, sometimes there's not.
Okay. Human?
I have two questions. The first one is that in terms of picking the city of Toronto, because you're from Cape Breton, so couldn't you do it with Halifax as kind of like a place to go? Because
Well, my dad was born in Cape Breton, but I was born and raised in Toronto.
you were born.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like a.
It's not quite as dramatic as coming to Toronto.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I noticed that Toronto was depicted in your other films, so I was wondering like why in this specific film you picked Toronto. The second question is the role of editing, because from what I read and what you said, so is it the main element that you're talking about making undramatic to dramatic in your style of filmmaking? Is it the use of editing, or what is it, like music? What is
Well,
it?
I mean, you can see evidences of that in if you have ever seen or recall Francis Coppola's film about Vietnam. What was the name? I've forgotten it all of a sudden.
Apocalypse Now. Apocalypse Now.
Yeah, Apocalypse Now. The whole sequence with the helicopters played to the music of the Ride of the Valkyrie from the Ring, from Wagner's Ring. And you notice that there's no underscoring film music in this film. There's nobody's talking, and there's no violins or anything playing underneath it. And that's because all three of us, Carol and myself and Francis, we learned film by taking music and marrying it to film, usually in complete counterpoint, in opposite ways. And I would take reality and put another reality on top of it. And that's what Francis did in that Ride of the Valkyries, with that image of the helicopter blades and the strident strings of Wagner. It just melted into absolute, like as if it was. You would have thought that music was written especially for that, and it just lifted and took it into another element. So I'm interested in seeing reality and forcing a different reality on it, and that's true in a lot of the sequences in this film too. But none of us did any sort of standard Hollywood or narrative film underscoring. I mean, I do it now. I wish I'd done it then, but I wasn't sophisticated enough to know how to do it. So there was no composer. I cut the film to records, and then I hired Bruce Coburn to sort of ape the records and the music that I had used. But all the way through this, they're all musical sequences as opposed to music building up the underlying drama, which is, valid too, but I just didn't do it that way. So, and Carol and Francis and I all came from that school of putting a different reality on what you thought you saw. You're looking at something, and I'm going to show you it in a different way, and a way that works dramatically for whatever I want to achieve.
Okay, I'll go to Cyrus.
You mentioned the story is undramatic, but to me, it's a story of a lot of people, and still a lot of people are struggling like that. So to me, it seems that you're trying to, I don't care if you think it's political or not political, but you're portraying a story that is very real and still is very real after 40 years. So to me, I have to congratulate you. It's great.
Thank you. Well, it's dramatic in that it's about their struggle, but also I'm using other elements to heighten that drama. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Canadian films. Most of them I just can't abide because they don't have any drama. They don't have any plot. They don't have any struggle. And film is, you go to a movie for the same reason you go to a hockey game or a football game. You go to see the Toronto Maple Leafs beat the Detroit Red Wings. You don't go to see the Toronto Maple Leaf A team beat the Toronto Maple Leaf B team. And you need that kind of struggle. And I've been an athlete all my life. I played competitive football until I was 45. I don't mean soccer kind, but American Canadian football. And so I understood that drama. And people who understand real drama understand the drama that's in sports. And it's the same principles. You go there to see a struggle. Now, it doesn't have to be a violent struggle. It could be a struggle within somebody's own soul, or to come to grips with some feelings he has within himself. It doesn't have to be physically happening on the screen, but it has to be a conflict. It has to be a struggle. And when I see films that don't have a struggle in them, I'm out of here. If this guy hasn't figured out how to tell a story in 15 minutes, piss on him. And I find that a lot.
Okay. I'll go to Amir.
Yes. What I like in this movie was about everyday life, the struggle of people who are coming in the cities and who knows have some problems. And I was not very interested to know, for example, why they became here, why they decided to come to the city. So I think that for me personally, one of the reason I like is what the movie is not trying to give any background or information. Leave it to the audience to understand why these things happening to them. So my concern is that in your second sequel you try to answer all of this, which I think is somewhat different from what we can see in this first movie, because this movie is very documentary style, it's very similar to New French Waves, it's very similar to the movies that don't try to work through psychology or through motives or through linear patterns. Don't you see, I'm just wondering, maybe at that time you had more interest in this style, and after time you become more interested in stories or plots. Am I wrong? I just want to know.
Well, one of the interesting things in the film is that, what many people have figured out, is that you've got two characters, one who's a realist and the other one's a dreamer. Pete being the dreamer. And Pete was always the character that I identified with, because I've always been a bit of a dreamer, an outsider in that sense. And what happens in the film is that Joey's the realist and Pete's the dreamer, but then after the marriage and everything, Pete then becomes the realist and Joey turns into the dreamer. This sort of reverse, where Joey's driving the film for the first 40 minutes, and then Pete drives it for the last 40 minutes. So there's a progression and a growth of the characters in there. And one of the reasons why the film can be so touching at the end is because it's so funny in parts of the beginning. If I took all that sort of broad humor out of the film, it would make the other part of the film not as moving, because you need that contrast to make films. Films are made from contrast, without getting too Marxist. It's the Hegel's dialectic. It's all about the basis of communism, which is force A meets force B and produces force C, not A and B. And it's like plates coming together and forming mountains. It's that crush of ideas and textures and sounds that make a film, give it an extra special drama that isn't just a mixture of A and B. It turns into something else, which is the philosophical definition of Marxism. And so, and that's always, sometimes you see films where directors think they make cute sort of transitions, like cutting from, there's a film made years ago where some guy's radiator is boiling over, and you see steam's coming out of the radiator of his car. Then it cuts inside a kitchen to a kettle boiling. Well, to me, that's the antithesis of what I'm talking about. And if you can remember some of the scenes in Lawrence of Arabia, there's a scene where he puts the flame to his candle, a candle to his finger, and burns his hand, and then he blows it out, and then it's just a flat plane and dead silence. So he's gone from sound to nothing, and an image of a flame which is going up like this to a flat horizon. That's contrast, and that produces its own kind of drama, and that is the essence of filmmaking, of films. And all filmmaking it's like those Ukrainian dolls. Just one gets smaller as you take them apart. And it's the same thing with film. It's an hour and a half version of the same kind of just taking shot A and shot B and producing effect C, and then you do that from shot to shot, and you do that within the scene, and then you have the scenes that do that to each other. So it's the way the film progresses from one. Film has its own kind of drama, and it comes from the clash of images, the clash of sounds, the clash of ideas, etc., etc. People think that the art closely related to film is either the theater or it's painting or photography. No, it's much more. Film is related. The only other art that shares the same value with film is music, because the essence of film is time. It's the only art that has time, where you can take time and expand it or compress it. You go to the theater, it's time for time. You read a book, it's how long you want to take to read the book, 2 hours or 2 years. But with cinema, it's playing games with time. It's very Eisensteinian, you know. It's very much relativity about the train passing this point and all that stuff. But that's the way it works. It has its own drama that's totally unique. And a lot of people just don't understand this. And I like films that are made by people who understand that.
All right. Are you done? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I go to the next question? Nassim?
Well, since it was your first film, was it hard to find non-actors? And was it hard to shoot the city, like this huge passengers passing by? Was it hard, all of these things?
Well,
How
it
did
was.
you find all of these non-actors?
One of the reasons why I had so much time was it was done with a 3-man crew. It was myself, the cameraman, the sound man, and a guy who was a graduate student in Chinese studies at U of T, who'd never been on a set before. And I said he wanted to work, so I paid him $100 a week. So that was it. There was the cameraman, the sound man, and some guy who'd never done anything about film, and me. So there was there's not a lot of people to deal with. So we had lots of time. And Richard Leiterman had done a lot of documentary shooting, and I had done a fair amount. I shot a lot of the scenes I shot myself. And getting the actors, I was just damn lucky. I was really lucky because they all came from the same spot. They all came from the same acting school, small acting school. And Paul and Doug McGrath knew each other, and so did Jane and Kale, the dark-haired girl. So I was lucky that they showed up, and otherwise the film could have been a complete turkey and long forgotten without them, and especially Paul. Even as good as the other people were, it was Paul's particular magic that made the film work.
Why? Why do you think it's magic?
Well, he had that goofy-looking face, and he was
Stubborn.
Yeah, and he was, drunk, he was a difficult guy in a lot of ways, but he was a sweetheart. Everybody loved him. You wanted to kill him half the time, and the other times you just wanted to put your arms around him.
This was true in reality too?
I'm sorry?
This was true in reality too? This was his character? Once you wanted to just hug him, the other time you wanted to kill him?
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, he was that way. He was very exasperating, you know. And he got us into a lot of trouble with the cops and started mouthing off to the cops. And I didn't have any permits, and nobody had permits in those days. And not only that, but I didn't have any insurance. And Paul and Doug were driving this beat-up old car that I bought for $100. And both of them had no driver's license, which they didn't tell me. They lied to me. Paul was suspended for drinking, and Doug had just come back from Vietnam, where he was in the American Army, and he hadn't taken out a valid Canadian license. So, so I got these two guys driving this rattletrap car around town, and if there'd been a serious accident, we'd all been in jail. And I had no insurance. I would know nothing. I mean, nobody would ever. Even today, when they make a low-budget film with a bunch of students, they've got. Look at some of these student films. They've got a credit list goes on for about 10 minutes. You know, and they've got like 30 people working on the film. And I didn't have anybody, and nor did I even know anything about it. And the cops, in those days, you didn't have to have a permit, because nobody even knew anybody was ever shooting a film.
I got to take a short sorry. I got to take
Could I continue with one more?
let me just take a short question from Connie and I'll comment.
I just wanted you to tell us who Paul Bradley was, what he did in life, his work. It says in some of the clippings that he worked at carnivals.
Yeah,
So-
Paul was a hustler. He was a carny hustler. He came from Cabbagetown, which is now all, you know, hoity-toity, but in those days, Cabbagetown was called Cabbagetown because it was the original poor Irish immigrants came there in the 1840s, 1850s. So they were all Irish Catholics, you know, and hard drinkers. And so that's where his roots were. And so he was a hard drinker, and he worked at a whole bunch of jobs. He used to steal things. And I made about 3 years after this, I made a documentary film about him called Born Hustler. And the kind of guy Paul was, he was absolutely brilliant. We followed him around with a camera for 4 or 5 days.